sure you know what's happening from our podcast. I'm not quite sure that I'm live yet, so I'm just talking to make sure that we're going. Again, this is the More to the Story podcast with Andy Miller from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. And I want to give you a couple of updates of things that are happening from the podcast. I had come to you a couple of weeks ago and mentioned that we'll be taking a month off of new content. And that was in part because I'm in a time of transition myself, as we're needing to hire. We have 3 vice president positions open, an executive assistant open, and now I'm kind of doing several of those jobs in addition to my new job as president of Wesley Biblical Seminary. And it's a new semester, and we have our largest group of students in our history, with more than 700 students who are studying with us this semester. I have 95 people in my preaching course this semester. And so it's a really exciting time, and there's a lot happening, much less having 3 teenagers. So that was my excuse. That's my excuse for not having new content in September. So you might see, if you follow the podcast, that I've re-released some old conversations that I've had. I had one that came out yesterday with Cricket Albertson on her book that she worked, in a sense, on with her grandfather, Dennis Kinlaw, Holy Happiness. I think in the next day or so, a podcast will be coming out with Brian Fickert, author of Dr. Brian Fickert, who is the author of When Helping Hurts. And we talked about one of his new books at that point, somebody that I've admired for a long time and who's helped me a lot. And then I have a podcast coming out with John Oswalt. And I think there was one more. Oh, I think we have I'm bringing back one of the Robert Gagnon podcasts as well. So that was a way I was going to fill up September. But then something happened. So, and this is it. This is what was going to be the slowest month in the history of the More to Story podcast, which is a 3-year history, became maybe the time where we're saturating the market with our information. So about 2 weeks ago or so, I had a friend reach out to me and said, Andy, have you thought about having on the candidates for bishop, the people who've been nominated to be bishop, this 2-year bishop position, an interim bishop for the Global Methodist Church? There are 9 nominees. I know a lot of them as it is. So, but I saw that and I thought, well, I actually saw my friend from the Plain Spoken podcast, Jeff Rickman, had some thoughts about that, and it wasn't working out for the way he wanted to happen. And so, honestly, in the midst of this busy month, I saw that it wasn't working out for him, and I just said, no, I don't really want to go there. But then somebody said, well, it's kind of a philosophical question that Jeff had, and he and I have gone back and forth on this a little bit, and so I actually looked at it like, they want to use a communication director to communicate to all of them. And I appreciate the sensitivity that a lot of people have, including Jeff, with thinking about not having some of the bureaucratic system in place that might create more distance between local churches and people in leadership positions. And I'm very sensitive to that. I appreciate Jeff's concern. I just want to highlight that. And I've shared that with him too. From my seat, where I was I didn't know. There are several of the candidates I didn't know. And so when somebody recommended that it was just this philosophical difference, I decided, well, I'll just go ahead and use a communication director because I don't want to try to find everybody's email addresses. And it made it easier for me. So with respect to that view that is shared there, I went ahead and just communicated with the communications director at the Global Methodist Church, and they all agreed that they would come on the podcast. And so I set up these interviews. So all of a sudden, then now I felt a little bit more responsibility to make this happen. And the way I do I'm just going to tell you what's happening behind the curtain, so to speak. Generally, what I do is maybe once a month, a couple times a month at the most, I'll set up interview morning or interview day. And then I'll put all of my interviews then. And then I have podcasts for a couple of months after doing several interviews. Generally, that's how I work. Well, all of a sudden I realized, whoa, I don't have time if I'm going to get all 9 of these candidates published in time to be able to anticipate the convening conference in Costa Rica. I'm going to have to do this pretty fast. So there is going to be a rush of information coming your way if you follow my feed, if you subscribe to our podcast. So I just wanted you to know that is coming. So I decided that my approach would be that I would interview each candidate, because my first thought was I'll have 3 candidates at a time, and I'll ask them all the same questions, and that will make it a streamlined process. And as I did that, as I was thinking about that, I thought, well, that could seem like a debate. And maybe I'm a little more attuned to political things in this season in the United States. So I just decided I didn't want to pursue that. That means 9 different interviews, and I'm keeping generally the same questions, though it's more conversational. And so sometimes I trail off in certain categories with people as we have some similar interests. So I've done 5 of those interviews right now, and they will start coming out tomorrow with the aim of having all 9 of those conversations published by the convening conference, with a little bit of space in there to make that happen. And those have actually been wonderful conversations. One of the things I like about podcasting is not just sharing it here. I mean, I do appreciate it. I love the feedback, and I love finding out from people all over the world that they're listening. It's a delight to see people picking up my courses. I just spoke with somebody, or emailed back and forth with somebody from Maine yesterday who's using my Heaven course in their church. Last month, I guess it's still August. So at the beginning of August, I found out a group, a Salvation Army church in Australia, was using the Heaven course, and I Zoomed in with them 4:00 in the morning, my time, but just to check in with them on that. And then I've also, just met people all around who are able to have access to podcasts. So it's a real blessing that God's using this platform in that way. And it has only so much sophistication, but part of the thing for me, the piece that I like connecting with various people. I like having conversations with interesting people. I like talking to NT Wright. I like talking with Cricket Albertson, and I've enjoyed talking to all of these Episcopal nominees. They are a delight, and it's obvious, like with them, why they're called into this, why they've been nominated, and why they've accepted that call to put themselves before the church. So and as somebody who will be a delegate at the convening conference, it's also really helpful for me to get to know them and the plans. I want to mention one thing I'm not able to say on all 9 of those podcasts. Well, a couple things. First, to my non-GMC, non-UMC listeners, I hope this will be interesting to you as well. Like, for instance, I'm just thinking about my friends who serve in other denominations like AIM, Church of Nazarene, Kojic, Kachusa, the Salvation Army, all these folks. What we're talking about in these interviews, I believe, is relevant to these denominations. Now, of course, there's differences in how denominations are structured and the polity of each of those denominations. But at the same time, I hope you'll find it interesting. It's like, and a lot of times we're learning about Christian leaders through these conversations. So I think that my regular listeners will find this interesting. It's not just a lot of minutia about the GMC and the GMC's political environment at this time. So just know that that's the first thing. The second thing I want to suggest, and I didn't put my everything on silent here. The second thing I wanted to suggest is that I do acknowledge that there are basically really 3 plans. I'm trying to get a place where I can put my hands up. 3 plans that are out there that could happen for the Global Methodist Church. And in addition to the 9 interviews I'm doing with the candidates for what's sometimes called the General Superintendency Plan, I also am doing an interview with Jay Therrell, who is the president pro tem of the Florida Conference, and he's part of one of the people who's drafted the legislation, which is sometimes called the hybrid or the Florida plan, which is different. It's a different model, and there's one basic distinction, one major distinction, and that is the nature of what a bishop would do administratively and as a shepherd. So in the general superintendent model, there is a bishop that comes and functions as a teacher and as a guide, kind of a missional of stopgap that exists to perform ordinations and the like. But in the Florida plan, and actually, I should probably just wait to point you to that conversation, that the bishop also has administrative duties. And honestly, where I am on this discussion, I don't know if I'm 50-50, maybe 55-45, somewhere in there, but I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with Jay to get more clarity on his plan. And I recommend that if you want that information now, there's a great interview that he had with Jeff Rickman on Plain Spoken. And so I checked that out. I also recommend that you go to one of our faculty members, our adjunct faculty and director of research, Matt OReilly. His, I think it's called, I'll have a link when all the podcasts come out. I think it's like Theology Project is his website, but you can find it. Google Matt OReilly, Global Methodist Church, and you'll find his, not his podcast, but his blog. And he has some articles coming out on this very subject. So if you're wanting to be oriented on that, I recommend you go there. And also Matt's new book that he's edited, that was from his Reconstructing Methodist conference, has an article from Scott Jones on this, or like maybe detailing the way that the GMC has come to this place. So I'm not getting into that debate. I'm just acknowledging that. And then, of course, there's a third option, which seems less likely to me, but it could be chosen by the General Conference. And that is for them to keep with the transitional book of discipline, like what the plan is there, to keep Bishop Webb and Bishop Jones doing exactly what they've been doing for another 2 years until probably the kinks are worked out on what plan is going to be used. So those three plans are there, and I don't acknowledge that fully on these interviews. So they will be coming out. I have, here's the order, just so you know. And I'm just releasing them in the order in which I scheduled them and I recorded them. So I have Carolyn Moore, a delightful conversation. Some of my friends who are in the Salvation Army will know she's started to become, I don't know, popular is not the right word, but her gifts are being used for the mission of the Salvation Army. How about that? Instead of just become, but she was at Lake Junaluska, where the Salvation Army has an annual conference that happens, and it's a beautiful event. And then she's, as a result of that, serving the Salvation Army more. And I enjoy that conversation with her. Kenneth Livingston from Texas. I had never met him in my life, and was so delighted by this conversation and just appreciated his energy and his fire for the Lord and evangelism. My friend Ryan Barnett was the third one that will come out. That will come out on September 2nd. So Carolyn's will come out tomorrow, and then Kenneth's will come out the day after that. Then next week, Ryan's will come out. Ryan's a pastor, and he was with me in seminary, a couple years older than me, 4 years older than me. Actually reveals his age in the interview. So he's a pastor at the Waco Methodist Church. He's been a leader in the WCA. I know he's been at other churches in the Texas area. And you'll note that it's like easy for me to have a conversation with him, and it's kind of like catching up on various things that are happening. He's been an active part of what's happened at Truett Seminary. Then Jeff Greenway, who is my seminary president, I recorded that conversation yesterday. They'll come out on the 5th, and he serves a church in the Columbus area for more than 15 years. And I'm going to say it. I'm going to repeat myself. I enjoyed that conversation. As also I enjoyed meeting Rob Townsend, who I didn't know really anything about except for just some of the information that's shared on the GMC website. And again, just a delightful conversation with somebody who has served faithfully in the United Methodist Church. And interesting about his story, like how God's led him to, even in a conference where he was a minority as an evangelical, to take on leadership positions, serve different types of churches, probably had some things that happened to him that were unfair. And he didn't highlight that too much. I had to pull it out of him, but just has a real heart for ministry and for serving the church. And so I was excited and enjoyed that conversation. Then I have the other candidates, Kimba, Greg, Leah, and John, coming on. I haven't recorded those conversations yet, but they're coming. And I want you to know that. So in between all of these are all these conversations are going to happen in the next 17 days. So there'll be 9 podcasts coming your way, in addition to the ones that I already had scheduled, these replays of old conversations with Brian Fickert, John Oswalt, and then, of course, the Jay Therrell interview is going to happen in there, and then Robert Gagnon one. So be ready for what's coming your way. And what I thought was going to be a quiet month for the More of the Story podcast has all of a sudden become more active. But I'm thankful for the opportunity for me to share with them on behalf of Wesley Biblical Seminary and on behalf of you, my listeners. I'm thankful to have you engage in what's happening here. And I just wanted to acknowledge some of the context of what was happening. I'm excited too by some of the other conversations I've had. I have these podcasts will be coming out well after General Conference, but I have David Bonson from the Bonson Group. He's written a book called Full Time. I listen to him on the world and everything in it as he gives a Monday money beat I mean, I imagine he's on Wall Street, but just somebody attuned to the markets. And I think his worldview is something that can really speak into our world at this time. And I think that's communicated through his book called Full Time. Then I also have J. Warner Wallace coming on. I have another person who's named Ryan. I can't think of his last name now, who wrote a book called Trustworthy, about the trustworthiness of the New Testament. I am working as hard as I can to get Bill Urey on this podcast. That is the most often requested guest. People say, have you thought about having Bill Urey on? And we just haven't been able to make it happen. But I think we're getting close. I'm excited about his book that's been published by I've said excited too much on this podcast. Forgive me. His book published by Francis Asbury Society, that's Christology as Theology. And I'm really intrigued by this concept. And I think that this book is going to have a much wider discussion outside of that book and outside of certainly the podcast that I'm going to do with him. But this comes in that tradition that I think stems from some of the kind of, I would say, founding voices in like critical voices in the evangelical Wesleyan world. And one of the principal ones to me is Dr. Dennis Kinlaw. And this is a series of books that's coming out. This one that Bill Urey has done. It's the first in this theology series that's building upon Dennis Kinlaw's book, Let's Start with Jesus. So, and you kind of sense that in the theme, theology, Christology as theology. So maybe I have that backwards, but nevertheless, is a Christological focus to theology. I'm looking forward to that conversation. Right, Bill? We're going to make that happen. And several other things coming our way. I'm glad to get suggestions. I have some things I'm going to put out some resources that I'm sharing in my preaching course as well. Just I think that might be helpful for people as they're thinking about their own preparation for teaching and preaching. I have 2 other new courses that sometime this fall are going to make their way to my website. I already have the Jude course, the 6-week course on the book of Jude that has a video series, discussion guides, and a discussion board online that's available. Then I have my Heaven course, which I've already talked about here. Then I have a course coming out on holiness. And it's a mini course. It's a type of thing you could do with a group of teenagers. So it's a kind of a basic, like, Holiness 101. Then I also have a course on, I was asked to do this, and so the resource available, it might only be interesting to a small segment of my audience, but that is the Wesleyan Foundations of the Salvation Army. So that will be hopefully coming out on my website here soon. I have you'll notice as these Episcopal interviews come out, I have a sponsor. There's some interesting groups. There's this group called True Charity that's doing some work with various Global Methodist churches and wants to connect with more churches. And so they've come to me and they're interested in the people who are in my audience. So at the end of each of those Episcopal conversations, there's a little interview, a 5-minute interview that I have with one of their executives. So I encourage you to check that out. And as always, I'd love for you to like, subscribe, and if I could get some people to share some reviews on Apple Podcasts, I think that would help us as well. You might have noticed as well that there's a new podcast coming from Wesley Biblical Seminary, and it's called The Biblical Wesleyan. This is a whole series of all kinds of content that will be happy. Content's not done here. It is like presentations that are happening at Wesley Biblical Seminary, rather they are chapels, academic lectures, conversations that we have. We had some things that we've already published there from our alumni reunion. So it'll be a weekly podcast at least of our chapel sermons, but that's something I would love for you to subscribe to, and something we're bringing your way in addition to other podcasts. Steve Blakemore and Matt Friedemann both have podcasts that come from WBS. We'd love for you to check those out as well. But I wanted to give you this brief update just ahead of what's coming our way on the More to the Story podcast. Thanks so much for praying and supporting this. Looking forward to connecting with you all through these various things that will be coming out in the next month. God bless you.